from the beginning, we have been hearing about the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and why African youth need to be to actively participate in the process, what it entails, what is contained in the document itself, and how is it going to protect biodiversity, as well as how you, as young people in Africa, can also be part of this ongoing process. So for this session, I'll be joined by Sefa and Mena, who are both policy co-coordinators at the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. So Sefa and Mena, I'll leave it to you. You can start the presentation. All right.
Okay, so we can start now, I guess, no?
Yeah.
Let me just share my screen and I'll share for the both of us. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to join you today. My name is Sefa. I'm an indigenous Ibalay Kankanay Igorot. I'm currently policy co-coordinator for the Global Youth Biodiversity Network together with Myrna. I'm from the Philippines. And yeah, we're happy to share with you today a bit on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Myrna, would you just like to introduce yourself before I go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Sefa. My name is Mirna. I am from Bolivia. And yes, together with Sefa, we coordinate the policy team in the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Yes, we can start.
Yeah, and please, we're very grateful if you can just share your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box so that we can see where everyone is and if there's anything that's not clear as we present. Okay, so I'll start and then we'll be taking turns presenting what is the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Okay, so we're all here, I'm guessing, because we care a lot about biodiversity, which is really like the web of life, the diversity of all life on Earth, and the interactions between them, right? We care about biodiversity a lot because it really provides us with, with what we need to live: food, water, air. It provides us with health through medicine and other ways. It helps regulate the climate. It provides many contributions like pollination, regulation, like clean water, and many other things, right? It's really the basis of a good quality of life. Biodiversity is very much also interlinked with cultural diversity. So the diversity of life on Earth is not just made up of ecosystem, species, genes, right? But it's also composed of cultural diversity, which is things like languages, worldviews, knowledge systems, practices, and norms of many different cultures around the world. And together, they really form, the basis of community and of things like music, like art. They provide us with inspiration and yeah, just a nice basis or quality of existing in this world. But we also know, right, that biodiversity is in crisis. Many reports have come up recently that 1 million species are estimated to be at risk of extinction. And this is very worrying. We know that when we lose species, we lose them forever. And it means that this web of life that we're talking about is really getting smaller. It's getting frayed. This thing that they call like the fabric of life. We know that nature's contributions to people are increasingly at risk. So you can see from this figure that like the regulation of air quality, of climate, things like the regulation of hazards and extreme events, things like learning and inspiration, support the ability of nature to support identities. All of these nature's contributions to people are all going down, with just very few going up, which is really the energy we extract, the food that we need, the materials and assistance that we are taking from nature, right? And this is very worrying because even while those are going down and some are going up, the distribution of the costs and benefits that we get from biodiversity is really unequally distributed across the world, and even within communities, within countries. There's a very big uh, inequity with the way these are being distributed. So what we're facing really is a big socio-ecological crisis. It's not just an environmental crisis. It's very much interconnected to the social aspects of, of the world. So what now? What do we do? Well, we have to address the drivers of these crises. We know that biodiversity loss and climate change are very much interconnected, right? Many of the direct drivers are causing both of these, and we might be more familiar with the direct drivers, which are like spatial land use change, direct exploitation, pollution, invasive species. But really, it's also the drivers of these two crises at a deeper level. The indirect drivers or the underlying drivers are also shared, and these have roots in formal institutions, in in our economies, in governance, in social cultural drivers, which are at its root about values and behaviors of people, and these are affecting human quality of life. And so what we need is change, right? But what kind of change? We need big changes to our systems. And scientists are calling this transformative change, which is a fundamental system-wide strategic reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors. What they're saying is that while incremental changes should still happen, like things like changing the way we behave at an individual level, this will not really create the level of change that we need. What we need is change at the systems level. So what do we do now? One of the ways that the world is trying to address, right, this crisis is through creating a global pathway for change to address biodiversity loss. And we'll be calling this from now on like the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which really aims to create a guide for action to reach the long-term vision of living in harmony with nature. This is being negotiated and developed under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is an international agreement between almost every country in the world that really aims to conserve biodiversity, to sustainably use biodiversity, and to share the benefits from biodiversity fairly and equitably. And this matters to us because the CBD creates mandates for our governments on how biodiversity loss should be addressed, and our governments must create plans and implement these plans on the ground, and in turn report back on their progress back towards the CBD. So this is how international policy flows to the ground and and ideally also it feeds back on the progress back towards the international level. And what has happened before the post-2020 plan is that we had a strategic plan with its 20 Aichi targets. You might be familiar with them. The targets had things like to understand the values and increase awareness in biodiversity, reduce pollution, minimize coral reef loss, protect a certain area, a certain percentage of the area of the world, things like this, and many other targets that are very important. It was a good plan, but none of them had been achieved in the time that it was supposed to be active. So as you can see here, none of them have been fully achieved. Some of them have been partially achieved due to many reasons like lack of political will, lack of resources, lack of bottom-up approaches, and many other reasons. I guess different people will tell you that different reasons why this plan worked, right? But now we have kind of a chance to create a new framework to drive momentum for action, right? And this is called the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and this is what we'll be talking about in more depth today to see what is contained in this framework so far, right? So yes, it will essentially replace the previous strategic plan, and it's currently under development, under negotiation, and it will be adopted during the next CBD Conference of the Parties, which is the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties. So CBD COP15, that's what you mean when we say that, which is the highest decision-making of the CBD decision-making body, and eventually they will finalize this framework. So you don't, just a bit of terminology, because the group that is tasked to negotiate the post-2020 GDF is called the Open-Ended Working Group, or the post-2020 Working Group, right? And this is just to let you know of the process to develop this. I guess you also talked about this earlier today, but you can see that we're now here. It's been a long time. This process started in 2018. It's called the post-2020 framework, but now it's 2 years late, as you might understand. Like, it's currently 2022. We're getting to the end of this process, and you might have heard that there's another meeting happening in just a few months in Nairobi, and eventually we'll get to the COP15, which is really the final stage of the development of this framework. And this framework has gone through several drafts, and I'll pass it now to Myrna, who will start talking about what this framework contains. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. And yes, as you have seen, we had several drafts already, and what we have now is the first draft. That is the last available draft that we have, and we can find it on the CBD website. If you go to the CBD int / post-2020, we can share the link. You can find these tabs, and if you go to the working group 2020, to the last meeting of the working group, that was the third one, you will have several tabs with the types of documents that you have. If you go to the official tab, you will find all the official documents. The number 6 is the first draft of the post-2020, and it's available in the 6 UN languages, so you can download it in one of these languages in PDF or Word format. But first, before showing you what is already on this draft, we would like to remind you that the content of this draft is under negotiations right now, so almost everything can change. But the focus issues are not going to change if the target is about invasive alien species or about the spatial planning or ecosystem restoration. That is not going to change. But a lot of things that like percentages or certain words or certain approaches that should be tackled in these targets, that is all under negotiations. We're going to show you a bit of an example on how complex it's looking like. So you don't need to read all of this, but this is only to show you how complicated it has become. And that is what we will have to deal with in Nairobi. So everything what it's in brackets right now, it's subject to discussions and negotiations. So it's almost basically everything. And the countries will have to agree on which text is going to remain. They are going to try to make it short, understandable, and easy to communicate. This is an example for target 1, that it's about a spatial planning for all areas. And we have this composite text for the target, and we also have alternative texts that have been proposed by like-minded countries. So countries will decide also if they prefer one of these alternative texts to the original text that has been proposed by the Secretariat. So this is just for you to see how it's complicated. But well, the idea of the first draft is that we follow this theory of change that comes from this current status where we have loss of biodiversity jeopardizing human well-being and sustainable development, to achieving a vision in 2015 where we all live in harmony with nature. And the way to do this would be through the accomplishment of the goals and the milestones and the targets, but also by the implementation of certain enabling conditions, tools and solutions, and responsibility and transparency mechanisms, for example. This is all going to be covered into 4 goals for 2050 and 21 action targets that we are going to see in detail. And throughout this, we would like to see gender-responsive, rights-based approaches and intergenerational equity approaches that should really be within each one of the goals and the targets. We can go to the next one, thank you. So the vision for 2050 is living in harmony with nature, which would mean that by 2050 biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used at maintaining their services and sustaining a healthy planet that delivers benefits for people as well, and not only nature. We also have a mission for 2030 that is to take urgent action across society to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity and ensure the fair and equitable distribution of their benefits to put biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030. So as you can see, the mission is more action-oriented, while the vision is more as an ideal scenario. After that, we have the goals and the milestones. The goals are for 2050. The milestones are like intermediate steps to achieve the goals. We have 4 main goals that are focused on first focused on ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity. This has to do with the integrity of ecosystems that should be enhanced, a healthy and resilient population of species, and genetic diversity that should be safeguarded. So this is more focused on this genetic aspect of biodiversity and ecosystem and biodiversity. Ecosystems aspect of biodiversity. The goal B is more focused on nature's contribution to people. We should be valued, maintained, and enhanced through conservation and sustainable use. So this has more social aspects also that should be discussed in this goal. The same for goal B, that is focused on the benefits from the utilization of genetic resources that are shared fairly and equitably. And the goal D has more to do with means of implementation, which is trying to close the gap between available and necessary means of implementation for the implementation of the whole framework. And after the goals and milestone, we have the targets. I'm going to explain some of the first group of targets that are all related to reducing the threats to biodiversity. So what we have after the first group of targets, the first 3 targets are actually very related. We have the first target focused on the spatial planning. In the first draft, it says that it should focus on ensuring that all land areas and sea areas are under integrated biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. Addressing land and sea use change, we will see if we are going to have in this target a percentage or no, if we're going to have a rights-based approaches more reflected into the target, if we will have a rights of indigenous peoples and local communities over their lands, for example, reflected also in this target. We don't know what's going to come, but we hope that it's going to be as integral as possible. Target 2, it's about a restoration. It has a percentage right now. We don't know if we're going to have a percentage, but it's more focused on the restoration of degraded ecosystems. Target 3, it's about protected areas and other effective conservation measures. This target has been widely discussed. It's the famous 30 by 30 target, because right now the proposal is that 30% of coverage is achieved by 2030. There is a lot of discussion going on. We also are developing our position. We held a workshop in partnership with UNESCO to think more about how qualitative criteria should be developed for this target, and not only quantitative criteria, to ensure that we have rights-based approaches were reflected in the target. The target 4 is more about management actions to enable recovery and conservation of species, and it also has to do with human-wildlife conflict. And we will see if this language remains or they are going to change to something different, because there are different language proposals by other parties. The target 5 is about harvesting, trade, and use of wild species being sustainable, legal, and safe. We still don't know if that's going to change or not either, but it has to do more with, well, we don't know also if it's going to have a component on the respect of customary use that will be important in this target. The target 6 is based on invasive endemic species and how we are going to prevent or reduce their rate of introduction. Target 7 is about reducing pollution from all sources. Here the discussion is if we are going to specify certain types of pollution or we are going to keep pollution broadly. And target 8, it's about minimizing the impact on climate change through ecosystem-based approaches. Now it's ecosystem-based approaches or nature-based solutions. This has been also a big discussion, and we don't know. It seems that both terms could remain. I think with that, we can go to the next set of targets.
I'll take over from the previous set of targets. So this is maybe I'm just going to take a pause and say this is maybe a lot of information if you're hearing about the framework for the first time. But the more you hear about it and the more you discuss it, it will become more familiar. And yeah, this is just the first view to see like what the framework actually looks like and what targets look like. And eventually, hopefully, we can see how it can be improved and also how it can be implemented, which is already coming very soon, right? So targets 9 to 13, which is the second group of targets, is focused more on making sure that people's needs are met through sustainable use and benefit sharing, right? The first group of targets that Mirna just explained were more on addressing a lot of the direct drivers of biodiversity loss. And this one is more about sustainable use. So target 9 is a target on nutrition, on ensuring that benefits like nutrition, food security, medicines, livelihoods from nature for people are ensured for everyone, but especially for those in the most vulnerable situations, right? We have many marginalized groups. This include indigenous peoples and local communities. It includes youth. It includes women. So target 9 is about making sure that those benefits reach everyone and leaves no one behind, right? Including in protecting customized sustainable use by indigenous peoples and local communities. Target 10 is about the managed ecosystems. So the agriculture, aquaculture, forestry. And it's about making sure that these areas are being sustainably managed so that they can be resilient for a long time. Some of the discussions around this target are whether we need to add more, like fisheries maybe is not captured in this target. Some parties are also saying that yes, maybe productivity is not the right word, or to explain that we want these ecosystems to be resilient rather than producing more and more and more, which is not necessarily maybe the most accurate word, or it might be misleading if you increase productivity without ensuring its sustainability. So target 11 is about ecosystem services that we might be familiar with in terms of regulating air quality, water quality, and protection from hazards and extreme events, and making sure these contributions are being maintained and enhanced. Target 12 is about increasing the area of access to and benefits from green and blue spaces for the benefit of human health and well-being in urban areas and other densely populated areas. So if you live in a city, this speaks especially to those living in cities. Some of the discussions that we're trying to bring into here is also to acknowledge that green and blue spaces play also a big role in developing connection to nature if you live in a city, right? Target 13 is about implementing measures to facilitate access and also the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from genetic resources. What this target is about is that genetic resources are often used to make a lot of, is used for making products that often lead to a lot of profit. And this target tries to ensure that the benefits coming from things like, pharmaceuticals, for instance, is going back also to the communities whose which were the source of those resources that were used by companies or governments from another country, not necessarily the source country, right? And making sure those benefits are being shared equitably. Moving to the third group of targets 14 to 21 are more about tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. So these are targets that are really relevant to making the framework work. And it's also about addressing the underlying causes of biodiversity loss. So when we talk about transformative change, a lot of the targets here are trying to aim at that. So target 14 is about integrating biodiversity values into the different processes of the governments. For instance, in their strategies to reduce poverty, in their financial plans, in their assessments of environmental impacts, and things like this. So hopefully this will be done at different levels of government and also across all the sectors, right, of the economy. And this is often called biodiversity mainstreaming. Target 15 is a target on businesses and making sure that they assess and report on their impacts on biodiversity and reduce their impacts, because we know that many of the large scale or industries that may be causing biodiversity loss often comes from the private sector. So this aims to make sure that our production and extraction practices are sustainable. Target 16 is about enabling responsible choices among society, making sure that we have access, like the general public has access to information that is relevant to make these choices and also to the different alternatives that are there. Target 17 is about biosafety or making sure that we try to minimize the risks that are associated with biotechnology. So biotechnology, for instance, through living modified organisms, can, if they're not properly assessed for the risks, they can cause irreversible impacts, and we want to try to avoid those things. So that's what target 17 is aiming for. And I'll pass to Myrna for the last few targets and the rest of the section.
Yes, and we are sorry because this is really, really a lot of content, and we are happy to clarify anything afterwards. But we're almost done with the targets, and then I will go to the last sections. So target 18, it's about perverse incentives or incentives that are harmful for biodiversity. This is a very important target because we need it to be as strong as possible to really eliminate these subsidies that are harmful for biodiversity in a just and equitable way. The target 19 is also very important because it's about resource mobilization for the implementation of the framework. The past framework has been very non-ambitious on this regard, so we expect that this target is going to be more ambitious. The number 10 billion per year is really low, and there are many voices that are asking for a greater commitment. And target 20 is one of the targets that is very important for us because this is about access to information, knowledge, including traditional knowledge, with a free, prior, and informed consent, and also about awareness, education, and research. As some of you might know, we have been pushing for a target on transformative education for a long time, and we didn't succeed, but at least we have it now reflected in a couple of targets, and this is one of the targets where it is reflected. So we hope that it's going to be better reflected also in the indicators that are going to be developed afterwards. And finally, target 21, that is probably the most important target for rights holders, is the target that talks about equitable and effective participation in decision-making processes by indigenous peoples and local communities, women and girls, and youth. So we hope that this target, that is the more human rights-based target is going to be strong enough. It's not going to be watered down by terms like according to national circumstances or things like this, and it's really strong. So, and we are also proposing that it reflects elements, for example, of the Escazú Agreement, so it not only talks about access to participation, but also about access to information and justice. And well, maybe it's good to know for you that in the first draft there is not a target 22, but there is a target 22 that has been proposed regarding gender approaches. That it talks more about empowerment of women and girls for biodiversity related decision processes, and we know that the parties are going to consider that one as well. And we're done with the targets, and we're going to see the last sections that are more related to the implementation mechanisms. As we have seen in the theory of change, we also, besides the targets, had implementation support mechanisms, enabling conditions, responsibility and transparency, outreach, awareness, and uptake. And we have developed, we have sections for all of these elements. We can go to the next slide, please. So yes, this is what I just explained. We can jump.
This one.
Yeah.
So I'm just showing where they are in the theory of change. So they kind of underpin the targets and make sure that they can be implemented.
Exactly. So the implementation support mechanisms are mainly the type of support mechanisms that we would need for the post-2020 framework to be effectively implemented. One of the most important ones is the financial mechanisms and strategies for resource mobilization. Here it's very important for us as youth, for example, that this financial mechanism takes into account youth-led projects, for example, and not only projects that target youth. Also, the capacity building and development strategy is very important because it also should take into account right holders as women and girls, youth and indigenous peoples and local communities. The mechanisms for scientific and technical cooperation and technology transfer are also very important. Knowledge management is also important, and the synergies or mechanisms that are relevant under other conventions, it's also very important. So the implementation goes hand in hand with the implementation, for example, of the climate goal, of the climate convention or the sustainable development goals. We can go to the next one, the enabling conditions. This was a very comprehensive section, for example, in the 0.5 draft, and now in the first draft it has been a bit reduced, which we regret a little bit because some very important elements are missing now. We had an enabling condition on the intergenerational equity that is lost. We had also one about the rights of nature that is also lost. But still we have integrative governance, participatory and inclusive whole of society approach, integration with other environmental agreements, and gender equality and empowerment. They are reflected, and we hope that these are going to remain. If we go to the next one, the section J about responsibility and transparency. This is other of the sections that has been reduced a lot. We understand that this also has to do because it also implies a big responsibility for the parties to report. We'll see how it goes, but we hope that also this section is strong enough so the reporting and evaluation processes that the parties are going to follow are as thorough as possible, so we can really assess if we are achieving the goals and targets for biodiversity in an appropriate way. And finally, outreach, awareness, and uptake. Sorry, I'm going to charge my computer. It's dying.
Do you want me to take? I'm
coming back in a second. I'm back, sorry. Yes, outreach, awareness, and uptake. It's also very important because it also has to do a lot with the communication of the framework and how it's going to be shared with other partners and in implementation. So it has to do also how we are going to increase the understanding, the awareness, and the appreciation of the values on biodiversity, how we're going to raise awareness about the existence of the goals and the targets of this framework, and how we're going to share the success and lessons learned and experiences in acting for biodiversity. We also hope that this is going to get a boost because the previous framework, the IG targets, were in a way very ambitious, interesting, and integrated a lot of important elements for us, but probably the outreach and awareness efforts were not strong enough. So many people know what the Paris Agreement is, for example, but not many people knew what the IG targets were. So we hope that this also is going to be boosted. I think that with this we are done with the first draft. There is a new section, but this is not a part of the first draft. This is a Geneva update. There is this proposition to include in the draft a section on the principles and approaches for the implementation of the framework. This is a very interesting section because it takes into account many of the elements that we are asking for, and many of these elements are also very related to a human rights-based approach. It talks about having a framework for all, to take into account the whole of governments and the whole of society, to take into account the rights-based approaches, empowerment of women and girls and youth, indigenous peoples, local communities, the One Health approach, full and effective and equal participation in implementation, gender-responsive approaches, synergies with other conventions based in sound science, in line with full respect of the precautionary principle. That is a very important principle for us because it's probably the most linked to the concept of intergenerational equity and the balance of the three objectives of the convention, that it's also very important. So we don't only focus on genes or ecosystems or fair distribution of the benefits, but we focus on everything what is there. And a transformative and innovative education, that is also something that is very important for us. So we are very supportive of this new section. We just hope that if this section is approved and taken into account, it's not going to mean that these principles are going to be deleted from the text of the other targets, because we think that all the targets need these elements, and for some targets it's very crucial that we have it written there. That is, for example, takes into account prior and informed consent of indigenous peoples and local communities, or that is implemented following a gender responsive approach. So yeah, that's only for you to know.
Yeah. Just to add, the other reason that we really want these elements to be in the targets themselves is that if they're not there, then they won't have indicators attached to them, as we know how important it is to measure and evaluate our progress towards those elements. So if it's only contained and restricted to this principles section, then we don't have any assurance of it actually being monitored. And we know that if we're not being monitored, then the contributions of indigenous peoples, women and girls, for instance, in Target 21 will be invisible, is what we are calling. Yeah, and just to end, we don't have time right now to go into much depth, but we're happy to answer any questions. To get an overview of what young people are pushing for, I'm sure this is something you'll also be talking about throughout the forum. But we prepared a document summarizing the three key priorities that young people have been pushing for throughout this process, which includes intergenerational equity and youth participation. It includes a transformative education and also rights-based approaches for people and nature. If you're interested in reading more after this, because I think we have to pass it back for questions, you can find this on our website, gibbon.org/policy, and you can also see other documents there that you might find interesting. And with that, if anything was not clear, I think me and Rena are happy to answer any questions. Back to you, Priska or Kevin, or yeah, Priska. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sefa and Mena, for the explanation. Just talking about what the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is, and also going through the targets, and just to this session is basically the anchor of the summit, and we hope that participants at least have an understanding of what the framework is all about and in which areas that you can participate in. The whole process is open to everybody to participate. So, with your young person, your indigenous youth, you can participate, and there are platforms like the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which is the official youth constituency under the CBD. You can also get in touch if you're a youth network that wants to participate in this. You are free to get in touch with Gibbon Africa, Gibbon International, and we can make it happen. If there isn't time, Mena and Sefa, I think we can just collect some questions and then we can forward them to you. But thank you very much for taking the time.
We can stay a few more minutes, I think, Priska.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to let you know,
yeah.
we can stay a few minutes.
Yeah, but yeah, thank you so much for just giving an overall overview of the framework. And we hope to see many youth after this participating tomorrow, and Saturday again, we'll be talking about some of the issues that Mena and Sefa talked about in depth, some of the challenges in terms of like what's included in the framework itself. Because you see, like there isn't much participation from African youth or Africans in these negotiations, and this is a global framework. So decisions are being made while we are sitting at home, while we are not worrying about biodiversity. And then when things start to go wrong, we start questioning what happened. This is the opportunity for young people to participate, get in touch with your biodiversity focal point. Smangele did share a document on how you can reach out to those. And then there's also the CBD link. You can find all that information. And again, if you need help in terms of like reaching out to them, you can always reach out to Gibbon Africa, Gibbon International, and we'll be happy to help. So do you guys have question time to answer one or two questions, or you have to jump off?
I think we can answer one or two questions, but then we have to jump off.
Okay, I'm just trying to see if there's any questions. Please post in the chat. To see people are saying thank you very much to the presenters for making it really understandable. And we made this session youth-led so that we don't bring in, your older generations to come to speak to us, but we have our peers, young people like us, showing us the way it can happen. And I hope to see many of you who are attending the summit one day to also be organizing such sessions and also teaching other people about that. So if there are questions from Amit, please ask my other co-host to just share with them, share with me, and then we can have, yeah.
Right. Yeah, we have a couple of questions here, and I think I'll just shout them out. Yeah. One is, there is a participant called Kat Jenkins. I hope I got that correctly. And she is asking, this might sound like a strange question, but do you think that time is often wasted during the COP meetings arguing about semantics, and in brackets, she says language use, instead of agreeing on the actual meaningful points of the framework? So that's one question. I don't know if you're taking all the questions at a go or you want me to read one by one.
I think we can have all the questions.
All right, so I will flip over to the next one. Zablon Ogola is asking, Africa is an excellent development, or rather Africa is on an excellent development trajectory, but this development is not done sustainably. How will the meeting in Nairobi, Kenya, help hold governments accountable to avoid making the same mistakes over and over again? So how do we get governments to be accountable to avoid the same mistakes? That's from Zablon. And then there's Janvan. Janvan Kobo is asking, is there a way the targets can be summarized to a summarized umbrella heading for each target, like the IG targets and SDGs, even in the negotiations for ease of reading? I think those are the three that I can see right now. If any other questions pop up, I will let you know. Thank you.
Who wants to go first? Okay, I'll take maybe the first and the third question. I think is maybe what I'll speak to first. So regarding the first question regarding wasted time during the negotiations, for me it definitely also feels like this. Sometimes I just want to like tell them to stop and even just check whether we're going in the right direction before they discuss the very specific things that like if we prefer this word or that, the things like this. It's also, yeah, and I think many people also have that analysis where we need to be focusing our time more on those elements where there are major disagreements, because unless we resolve those major disagreements, we will have much more difficult time coming up with a framework that everyone agrees to. So the CBD works by consensus, and everyone has to agree on what this framework will contain. And if time is wasted on smaller things, then it will be very difficult to have everyone on board on the bigger things that are more contentious. Things like resource mobilization, for instance, is one thing that countries disagree on, especially between developing and developed countries. There are disagreements on whether on digital sequence information, which you might be discussing in more depth, and on things like how we can ensure that we are reviewing progress well, like the best way to review progress, things like these. There are many major disagreements that still remain, as you can see with the brackets, but some of them are bigger concerns than others. And so much more attention needs to be going to those. On the third question, regarding like shorter names for the targets, so that's not the way that the framework has been negotiated. I think that the approach that the governments have been taking was to negotiate it and then leave the communication to after, something like this. I don't know if you agree with this approach or not, but the way that they've been doing is to negotiate targets in the form that they are, like we presented, and then eventually when it's adopted, communication experts will come in and figure out the best way to communicate them. So that just to provide some insight on that, although I agree that the SDGs are quite good in terms of being very easy to communicate, and it's not looking like that for the post-2020 so far, is what my personal view. I'll pass to Mirna. She wants to answer the questions, and maybe also the second one. I'm sorry, it's a difficult question for me.
It is indeed. Thank you, Sefa. I think Sefa covered the first and the third question brilliantly, so I will try to do my best to cover the second question. And I see another question from Ismail on the chat. I will try to cover that one as well. Well, I don't really have maybe the best answer to the second question, but maybe some ideas. I think that in general it's very difficult to hold governments accountable, because in the end, all of this has to be translated into national legislation, and it really depends on the commitment of each country on how they are going to translate this into their NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, and how they are going to report and how inclusive they are going to make this process. I think that one key thing for accountability is inclusion of all relevant right holders. So maybe that's one of the most important points, because if we have women and youth, indigenous peoples, local communities taking part not only in the implementation but also in the review, reporting, monitoring mechanisms on how the governments are performing, then governments will care more about doing a proper job in the implementation. What the Nairobi meeting can bring as an opportunity for this is that we can maybe take advantage that this meeting was not planned before, and everybody's kind to, I don't know, everybody's kind of improvising their strategy on what to do for Nairobi. Maybe it would be a good moment to approach, especially African governments, to see if they can include somehow youth participation. We have heard from the head of the African Union that they are going to try to include young people in their discussions towards Nairobi. They are not going to have funds to bring youth people to Nairobi, but at least they are going to try to hold discussions when they include youth groups to try to make their positions part of the national positions. So at least having this kind of compromises by the governments or commitments by the African governments to ensure that these voices of right holders are taken into account in the government positions or are taken to the negotiation process would probably be a game changer in terms of participation afterwards in the implementation as well. So that's for the second question. And for the question of Ismail on the chat, it's about anything related to energy and biodiversity, especially green technology. I think that yes, there is not a specific target on energy and biodiversity, but it can be tackled in some of the targets. I think that the target 12, that it's about access to green and blue spaces in urban areas and dense areas, dense populated areas. It can be a target that will need a lot of innovation in green technology and energy, sustainable energy. The target on climate change, mitigation and adaptation will also have a lot to do with the use of sustainable and alternative energies that are that emit less carbon, for example. And the complete change of the energy matrix is more related to climate change than biodiversity, so it's going to be probably more tackled in the target 8 related to climate change. And other types of technology are being covered in other targets as well. For example, the targets about increase of food production, or the target related to control of invasive alien species probably are going to also need innovations in technology to make this implementation better. But yes, I think that's going to be a little bit mainstreamed along the framework.
I think you're on mute, Priska.
Sorry, I didn't realize I'm on mute. But yeah, thank you so much, Mene Sefa, for answering the questions. I see a hand by Nukulunga. It's been up for a while. I don't know if you're still there or if you can post your question. Because unfortunately, you have to use the chat box for this one, or if Cherise can give access to speak and then they can ask their question, and then we'll wrap it up. Oh, see the questions in the, okay. I think this question was answered. Are there any rooms for compromise when it comes to disagreements? And yeah, and Smaggle is also responding to some of those questions, but yeah. I think in terms of what is not included in the framework itself, like when you look at it, it's not going to be perfect for everybody. And that's the reason why there is this ongoing process where you can submit comments, either as a network, or you can, come together as a youth group, a conglomerate of youth networks to sort of like say, these are what we wish to see in the framework, like the issues of technology, energy, and if you feel like it's an important issue that is being omitted, then this is the opportunity for you to contribute. After the session, we'll have sort of like an activity where you can sort of like provide some of these comments that you want to see included in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and that will sort of like form part of the youth statement as an outcome from this summit that we can use as an advocacy document to say, young people who gathered for this summit, these are the things that they're prioritizing and would want to see in the framework. Or if you want to also support youth statement position papers that Gibbon has, you're also free to do so. You can also always reach out on platforms, and we'll be sharing again information through the emails for those who registered. We'll also share the position paper from Gibbon if you're interested in receiving that. So you have that information and everything that you need to participate actively in this. And it's important for us to adopt a robust post-2020 global biodiversity framework that has measurable, ambitious, realistic, and time-bound targets. And of course, there are issues of implementation, funding. There's Africa, looking to developed nations to help with the funding. And those are some of the arguments that have been coming out. And if we do not stand strong as a united Africa, it means that our voices will not be heard. And this is what this platform is meant for, to raise our voices, raise ambition for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and its implementation. So yeah, thank you so much, Mina and Sefa. Yeah. So this brings us to the end of the first part.